question I get asked quite a bit is, how do you build organics? And while I did make a video on this previously showing some basic tips, I really didn't get into too much of the details of my thought process. That was more of a how to go about doing it with commands and some basic things to think about. This video is going to go a little more in depth on how I actually perceive things as I'm building and some techniques that you could follow. And to illustrate it even better, I'm going to be showing you how to build organics by hand, so it's not just limited to Java players who have access to World Edit. These are some techniques that hopefully any Minecrafter can use if you're interested in building organic sculptures of any kind. Chances are if you're watching this video, you already know what an organic is, but for anyone who doesn't, an organic is anything that's living, such as a human or an animal or a plant. But I would take it a step further in Minecraft to say that an organic is anything that's built with curves and organic shapes, as opposed to geometric shapes. Organics make use of curves and tend to flow more, whereas geometric shapes are more rigid and structured. So, how do we actually go about building organics? I can give you one simple answer. With a lot of patience and a lot of practice. And that's really all you need to know for how to build anything. So I think you're good to go. I'll see you later. But in all seriousness, there really is no set way to build. And it's not something that's just gonna happen overnight. It takes time to develop any kind of skill. While you may not be at the level you want to be yet, just remember everyone had to start from somewhere. A lot of times when you see people who are really good builders, it could be that they have been building for quite a long time, or that they have some kind of artistic background, which would be myself. So what about the person that knows all the commands, that knows they have to follow proportions and make a wireframe, and they know all these things, but they just want actual techniques to follow? Well, that's what I'm hoping this video can help you with. So we're going to do a build from start to finish, and I'll explain to you my thought process for every single step and maybe some tips for each step. And you might already know some of these, that's a given, but this is just how I work, and again, I'm hoping it will help you. Step 1 is to get an idea and or a reference photo. I feel like most builders out there use a reference photo of some kind. I oftentimes come up with an idea first, then draw it out to help me visualize what I'm thinking, or look up a reference photo to help support my ideas. Ultimately, whatever your idea is, the more references you have of it, the better, so that you can more accurately portray it. Once you have a good solid reference, here are a few tips for how we can analyze our reference before we start building. We have a picture here of a hummingbird. I can take any measurement I want and compare it to other measurements in that same form and see how they relate to each other. By doing this, I can estimate that the beak of this hummingbird is a little less than 1/3 of the body length. And this is what I do to help me figure out the proportions of something. Once you have a good understanding of proportions, then you can also look at the positive shapes and the negative shapes in this same image to really just look at the shapes in general, see how they're outlined, and see how they fit with each other. My brain is wired very strangely, where anything I look at, I automatically see the shape of it, or I see the outline. And once you have the proper proportions measured out, you just recreate that shape and you'll get a full form. This might not come as easily to some people, but think about it this way. The more measurements you make, the more accurate your form will be. If you have a hard time eyeballing it and just drawing what you see, then just measure it to death and you will be much more accurate than if you didn't. That is something I learned for how to draw in 2-dimensional space, but what about a 3-dimensional space, which is what we're doing in Minecraft? That's where wireframing comes in. Wireframing is basically drawing in a 3D space. So we need to determine the shapes, or the outlines, if you will, of every angle instead of just 2D. This has always come easy to me because of all the drawing I have done in the past, so there's definitely a factor of past experiences in drawing which have helped me pick up 3D more easily. I'm going to do a demonstration build using this reference image. I chose this one because it's a bit more challenging. It doesn't give me all the information I need to accurately portray this pose, but let's have a go at it and see how it goes. The first thing I need to think about is space. What is the space I want this shape to fill? So I need to lay out some basic things like body length and height and leg height, just basic things like that to help me get an idea of the space this is going to fill. And I know my photo gives me very little information, so I actually did look up some other reference photos, and I actually drew this little sketch of the top of the fox just to give me an idea of how I think the top would look. I I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but it really did help me combine that with my reference photo to help me get an idea of the space that this will fit in. In conjunction with space, we need to think about proportions. I need to make sure that one leg isn't longer than another, that they're both consistent, and that they're consistently measuring up to other parts of the body. Remember the hummingbird example? That is the step I am talking about. Once you have the proportions and lengths figured out, you can start wireframing and adding shapes to your build. Now there's a lot of important things to think about when creating the shapes. I'm thinking about positive shapes, the shapes that are actually part of the form, and the outlines of them. I'm thinking about them two-dimensionally and then inserting them into a 3D space, which does take a bit of practice. I'm also thinking about the negative shapes and looking at those. If there is a shape that is not part of the actual form, it is a shape nonetheless. So I want to make sure that the positive and negative shapes are both linking together and are both as accurate as I can get them to be in a voxel environment. Something else you need to think about, and it's probably most important, is the anatomy of what it is you're building. I'm not an expert at anatomy of a fox, but I know for a fact that they have backwards knees on the backs of their legs, as do a lot of creatures like this. And that I need to make its back a little bit arched. Just things like that that you need to think about. And once you have a decent understanding of anatomy in your head, that's when you really can try making up your own poses with different animals without using as many reference photos. This is something I guess that you'd see more in a fantasy type build. If you ever building a dragon, for example, every picture of a dragon out there is just concept art. And where do they come up with those poses? Well, because they have a basic understanding of anatomy, they're able to take that knowledge and transfer it into a more fantasy-like setting. At least that's how I perceive it. I could be completely wrong, but it makes sense in my brain. Something else that's very important that a lot of people oftentimes overlook is weight distribution. You don't want your organic to look like it's falling over. You want to make sure it looks like it's standing solidly or in a solid pose, and that it has the balance that it needs to be portrayed accurately. Now, of course, if you're doing something that's flying or floating midair, it won't make as much of a difference to account for the weight. But that's something to think about. Those things are basically all I think of as I continue to build out this shape, but you have to constantly be checking, every angle to make sure they're all looking correct. If you're building something by hand, like I am doing here, you'll also want to account for smoothing as you're building. Normally, whenever I'm building with commands, I don't do the smoothing until afterwards, but since I'm doing it all at once, I can just do it as I go here. Some really quick tips on smoothing. I know I gave some before in another video, but I want to give them again. If you ever have a standalone block or a single block hole punched in your organic, chances are you're going to want to fill it in. It can be a big distraction unless it was purposefully put there. Something else to consider is the spacing in between all the layers. Now, a lot of this has to do with the angle that you need from the side view, which I'm not showing here, but I personally think it looks a little better to have more breathing space in between the layers. As long as it's not messing with the angle from the side, I would recommend doing this. Probably the biggest tip I can give for smoothing is to try as much as possible to avoid a stair-step look. Here's a simple example of the same basic shape smoothed two different ways. Unless you're wanting a really flat surface, it's better to smooth using curves instead of straight lines, because the more straight lines and diagonals you use, of course, the more blocky it's going to appear. This really depends on the context of what it is you're building, but most of the time when I'm building an animal or a human, I am going to want to use more curves when smoothing. One more final tip is, if you're ever building with a lot of vertical lines, it usually looks better to break it up on diagonals. This again is us trying to get out of the blocky look of Minecraft and trying to make as many curves as possible wherever we can. There is such a thing as over smoothing too. Make sure you're not smoothing to a point where it's ruining your form. Ultimately, it's the form that I think about first and foremost, and smoothing is just a secondary thought. So don't think that you need to smooth something just because it has a sharp edge. If it's going to mess with the actual form, then you're probably not going to need to smooth it. I am not an expert at coloring and details. In fact, I consider myself very bad at it. That is probably what I need to work on the most, is getting the details and stuff in my builds. But some things that I think about that might help you are, first of all, the shadows and the highlights of the build. Now, I built this fox completely in its mid-tone. I just picked a mid-tone block and then I was going to add in the shadows and highlights later. So think about where your shadows and your highlights are going to appear and replace those areas with a darker or lighter block. So on my fox, I'm going to take a much darker block and place it wherever I know there's a shadow. I am using my photo as a reference and looking where any of the dark lines are, and then I'm going to create a gradient to gradually transition that block to the midtone. Something to try to avoid is speckling blocks in too much, because that creates a whole other texture. Unless that's something you're really going for is the texture, you should use it sparingly. Bottom line, think about your shadows, highlights, and midtones. Think about gradients and making smooth transitions. And I could be missing something, but that's pretty much all I do for my coloring. And I know the coloring on this fox isn't perfect. Keep in mind, I had built this guy 3 times, and by the 3rd time around, I was tired of looking at this guy, but I did want to do a quick coloring demonstration, so I decided to do a very quick one, very rough one. I know that this video has been very detailed, and I tried to condense it as much as I possibly could, but I'm hoping that this video can help clarify maybe some of the thought processes I actually go through when I'm building. I really can't describe it any better than I have laid out in this video. Everyone has their own way of doing stuff. This is just how I think about things as I create art. And I will admit that all of the steps I have laid out for you, I sometimes skip some of them as I'm doing art. It's not like a step-by-step thing I follow every single time. These are just some things I've come to recognize over time and that, in a way, come naturally to me a little bit because I don't have to think about it as much. But I truly hope I was able to help you in some way. Don't you sometimes wish you could connect your brain to somebody else's brain and then automatically have all of their knowledge and abilities? That would be so nice if we could do that, but nope, we all have gotta practice, we all gotta start from somewhere. This is the best I can do to explain my process to you, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you all so much for watching this video and for being patient and watching the whole thing all the way through. I hope to see you again sometime, but until then, have a great day and have fun building.